Well, good morning everyone and welcome to the show. Today we have a From the Install Bay. This one is a viewer question. Someone said, hey, tell me about the sizes of shrink tubing and braided loom and all these colors and what this stuff. Basically install accessories. Those little things that we use that make the installs a little bit prettier. You know, finishing off the wire and whatnot. There's tons of sizes that we use and each one is for a little bit different application. So we've put together a list and we're going to tell you what we use them all for. Sounds exciting? I hope so. Let's head over to the bench and let's take a look. So what we've put together is a bunch of different size wiring, heat shrink, specialty heat shrink, braided loom, everything that we use we've kind of put together, and we're going to talk to you about how we use each one. The first thing, let's take a look at the wiring that we have that we deal with on a daily basis. We have some 0 gauge, we have this new dual 4 gauge. This is for a lot of the aluminum vehicles or Corvettes or something where you need to run a power and ground. The reason why it's this color is because of the marine use for it. They make it in a dual 4 and a dual 8. It's very handy. Then you just have regular 4 gauge, you have some 8 gauge, 12 gauge, some remote turn on, 18 gauge, 10 gauge speaker wire, 12 gauge, 16 gauge, RCAs. So we have the full gamut of stuff here. And then over here we have our sizes of loom, heat shrink, as we said. First thing we want to talk about though is the heat shrink. Now there's 2 different types of heat shrink that we use, not sizes, types. And actually, to be truth, there's 3, but we're going to start here. This is 1/2 inch. Now they both pretty much look the same, but the difference is in the shrink. This is a 2-to-1 ratio, this is a 3-to-1 ratio. And as you can see, the holes are a little bit smaller. They're so much smaller that the 3-to-1 will actually fit inside of the 2-to-1. Now the reason why you might want to use 3-to-1 as opposed to 2-to-1 is so that you actually don't have to stock this many sizes. The problem is 3-to-1 is typically a little bit more expensive. Now, depending on what the heat shrink is for, is whether or not we buy a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1. Now let's start with what everybody knows, which is the cool 5-star heat shrink. This is a 3/4 heat shrink that is a 3-to-1. Now the reason why we went 3-to-1 on this is because at 3/4 it will easily fit over a 0 gauge wire and also a 4 gauge wire and shrink down to size. So here's an example of it being used on a 0 gauge, as you can see. With the ferrule, it's nice. So what that allows us to do is we only have to stock one size of this. Now the problem is it doesn't shrink down all that well to an 8 gauge. We're actually thinking about getting the next size down to use on 8 gauge. At the time when we bought these, we weren't using that much 8 gauge, but now with the popularity of the Rockford Mini T amplifiers, we are using a lot more 8 gauge. Now we'll break this into 2 segments. We'll talk about heat shrink first, and then we'll talk about braided loom. So all this heat shrink is in a 2-to-1 ratio, and we stock both black and red in these sizes. We also stock yellow in most of these sizes here for when we have to do anything video related. First size up, the one we use the most of is going to be 1/8 inch. The reason why we use the most of the 1/8 inch is because it is made for the 18 to 22 gauge wire. So when you're building a harness, this is the size shrink wrap you're going to be using. So when you solder these 2 wires together, a little heat over this, and you're good to go. Now 1/8 inch is really only good for that, meaning it doesn't do anything else. Like trying to fit 2 wires in here, they'd have to be like 30 gauge wires to get 2 of them in here. So that's it. This is just for joining 2 wiring harnesses together. Now the next size up is going to be 3/16. We use so much of both of these 2 that if you notice on my workbench, I have these 2 bins right here. This is full of 1/8 inch and this is full of 3/16. Now the reason why I have that is because when you're doing a harness, sometimes you have to do 2 wires together, such as let's say 2 grounds. This will sleeve over 2 just fine, and it will shrink down to 1. Now what you might be thinking is, since it will sleeve over 1 wire just fine, why not just use this for everything? Now you might be thinking, since it'll sleeve over it and shrink down on this, why not just use this size for everything? Well, because when you do shrink it down, it does shrink down and it is a little thicker. So when you have 10, 12, 13, 14 of these all in, that thickness adds up real quick. So I like my wiring harnesses nice and thin, so I prefer to use as much 1/8 inch as I can. Next up is gonna be 1/4 inch. Now 1/4 inch is, there again, it's an odd size. It really only is good for 1 wire, and that's gonna be 16 gauge. It'll go over the end of a 16 gauge ferrule, so if you're terminating at something and you wanna cover it, it's good for that. If you need to cover up a 10 gauge or a 12 gauge connection, it's good for that. But we don't use a whole bunch of it. Honestly, you know, we do 1 inch at a time, because most of the time we are using it just to cover the end of a 16 gauge wire if it's going to get plugged into a box. Now something that we use more of is going to be the 3/8. 3/8 gets used a whole bunch. As I just showed here, 12 gauge ferrules, it's awesome for that. If you need to join two 12 gauge wires together, or you just want to put a braided loom over it like this, and you want to cover up the ends so that it looks pretty, it will go over that as well. So this does get quite a bit of use. It also works good for 8 gauge, so if you're having to terminate an 8 gauge wire with a ferrule on the end of it, this will go over that no problem. And of course, just like on the 12 gauge, if you're going to put braided loom over this, you can use this to cover up over the wire. Now next up, there again is another workhorse. This is the 1/2 inch. Because we use these, we don't use as much 1/2 inch, but where 1/2 inch comes in handy is with RCAs. So if you're going to do a standard barrel type connection over some RCAs, like you're doing some headrests or an overhead, this is the size shrink wrap you're going to use to cover those up so that they don't pull apart. It is also used on the end of 4 gauge when you're going to go ahead and put your braided loom over the 4 gauge to finish that end. You can also use it over the dual 8 gauge if you're going to be doing the braided loom on that, and of course it fits over the ferrule just fine. Now if you're going to be running a dual 12 gauge and you're going to be putting the Flex Loom over it like this, the 1/2 inch is going to be what you're going to use to cover up this braid here so that you have a finished end as well. Now one thing I did forget to mention when we were talking about the 3/8 is if you're doing a dual run of 16 gauge with braided loom, the 3/8 is what you're going to use to cover that. If you're doing like a truck box or something where there's a left and a right and you're just running 16 gauge, this is the combination you're going to use to do that. Don't worry, we'll talk about the sizes we're using for the braided loom when we get to that. Then the last size here is the big dog. This is 3/4. This is a 2:1 3/4. This is a 3:1 3/4. And this is where like sizing gets kind of strange. You could say this is a little bit thicker than this. So you don't measure across here to find the size. Now what this is used for is basically anytime we're using the biggest braided loom we have, or we need to go over, let's say, a bunch of RCAs like this, we can run them through. So if you stagger the RCAs, you can fit 6 RCAs through the end of this to put over the end, so when you're using the big braided loom, you have a finished end on it. This is what we use when we use the Rockford P300 boxes with the braided loom. We run 2 8 gauge, a remote turn on, the base knob, and the high level to low level through this end. So you can put a lot of stuff through the end of this and it gives you a nice finished end. So some specialty heat shrink that we use is this guy. This is a 1/4 inch blue, and what this is used for is when we do a remote turn on, we'll go ahead and use this to cover up the end over the ferrule that we're using so that it all matches and looks pretty. We also use these 4 colors here, your purple, green, white, and gray, when we're doing RCAs. These will go over the tips of the RCAs, and that way we'll know which RCA is to go in which input. Basically we use white because this is driver's front, passenger front, driver's rear, passenger rear. Just makes it easier so that we can just look at the colors on the tips of the RCAs and quickly know which one we have. Now these are 3:1 because we don't know what size tips the RCAs are going to be. These are all 1/2 inch. And then the last specialty piece that we carry is this clear right here. Now this is a 3/8 3:1 so that it can shrink down a lot. This is so we can put a label underneath it, shrink it down, and it'll protect it. And then there is one more, this guy right here. If you'll notice, it's a little bit different than the others because it's round like this. Now what makes this one unique is that it actually has silicone inside of it. What we use these for is when we're doing a backup camera and we want to make sure that we have a nice waterproof connection at that point, we put this over it. The hole gets very small. Squeeze it here. There we go. See that? Yeah, it's the silicone. So this will make a nice waterproof connection for you back at that camera and keep everything nice. Ooh, that's hot. It stays hot for a long time too. And this does require more heat to heat up than these do because you're heating up the silicone and the tubing itself. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our braided loom that we use. Now one thing to note before we start talking about all the different braided loom is you have to be able to cut braided loom. Typically you don't want to cut braided loom with scissors like this. Now there are certain looms that you can cut with scissors. This is not one of them. And the reason why is because it will fan and fall apart just like this. And then it becomes useless. And the more you touch it, the more it will fall apart. So what you want to use is a hot knife. What a hot knife does is it burns the end as you're cutting it. Now, you don't want to pull it tight like this and cut it, because what that does is that could possibly melt your end together so that you can't get your wire through, or it will make the hole, depending on the size you're using, smaller than you want it to be. You won't be able to get the wire through. So how we like to do it is we just kind of push it together like this, just kind of make it fat, and go through it like this, nice and slow. And then if you grab it real quick and do this, it will give you a flared end. Now the flared end will go down once you put the heat shrink over it, but will make running your wires through it super easy. Don't leave it on also, because this thing gets really hot and you can burn up your knife. Chinese finger torture. All right, now let's head over to the bench and take a look at the sizes we use and what they're for. As you can see, we use a couple different sizes and a couple different colors. Now the first size up is 1/8 inch blue. And what we use this for is just remote turn on. That's why we have it. The one thing I will tell you is when you do use a hot knife, it melts the end, and it melts the end really, really tight. Even if you do a push like this, it never really gets wide enough. So sometimes you just have to take like a pick tool or something and kind of poke it into the end there, and then you can fit your wire into it and it'll go through the end. And as we said, we use the specialty blue heat shrink to go over the end of it to finish it off, so we have a blue all the way through connection. Next up is going to be another 1/8 inch, and there again, as you can see, they don't all come in the same size. Even though it's sold as 1/8 inch, it might be a little wider and this is a little skinnier. This is just a black version of this for the most part, and we use it to do just that. We'll use it to cover wires. If we're running an OBD2 harness for, like, say, an iData and they didn't cover the wire, then we'll use this to do the same thing. This will expand out a lot more than that just because it is a different version of the braiding. And there you go, you can fit 2 wires in it and it'll give you a nice insulated end. It won't go over like the tip of a Bluetooth microphone because it doesn't get big enough for that microphone to go through there. It would be a murder trying to put 5 feet of this over that. Now, one of our most popular sizes is this guy. We use a ton of this. This is 3/8. 3/8 is good for almost everything you're doing in the install bay. And we'll start here. We have 2 16 gauge speaker wires. 3/8 goes right over it just like that. You have 1 10 gauge. 3/8 will go over that. Obviously, if you have a 12 gauge, it'll go over the 12 gauge no problem. Now, 2 12 gauge, it'll do it, but it is gonna be really tight. So I probably wouldn't recommend, see, it'll go over it, but it's gonna be super tight. And if you need it to be flexible at all, I wouldn't use it. But you could, like I said, you can do it. What you're gonna use it for the most is the 4 gauge. It will go right over a 4 gauge, no problem. And because it'll go over a 4 gauge, it'll obviously go over an 8 gauge. And there again, if you're gonna do a dual 8 gauge, it will fit, but as you can see, it's exposed a lot. So it will fit, and that's why it is very helpful just to have 3/8. What you really want is 1/2 inch for something like this. 1/2 inch will go over it just fine, and it'll keep it nice and flexible. What happens is the tighter this stuff gets, the less flexible it becomes. So if we go back to that dual 12 gauge now with the 1/2 inch, you keep a nice flexible connection and these 2 wires aren't going to get bound up. There's some room for twist. Now 1/2 inch will also do the dual 4 gauge. However, just like putting the 3/8 on top of the other stuff, it is going to be really tight. What you'd want is this guy here, which is 3/4. 3/4 goes over that, no problem. Now backing up just a bit, another thing you can use the 1/2 inch for is if you're gonna do an RCA run. Let's say you have 4 RCAs that you're running, go ahead and fan out the end. And what you do is you wanna do them duck in a row so that one is followed behind the other. And then you can fit in the other one behind that, and you can fit in the other one behind that. So you end up having 4 little RCAs going at a time through the ends. So this will cover up 4. Now if you have 6, you want to use 3/4. 3/4, you can do 6 RCA. If you're getting the cool Stinger 4000s like this one, they lay nice and flat in that 6 RCA. You can line them up and they'll stay nice and flat inside of this. It looks real sexy and it'll fit underneath the carpet. Super cool. Now for 0 gauge, this monster here, that's going to be 3/4. It'll go over the end just like that. Put your shrink cap on it, you're all good. That's not to say that you can't use 1/2 inch on 0 gauge. You can. in. It'll go over it just fine. It will just be nice and tight on there. Now when we do the Rockford P300s where we're using this big shrink wrap, this is what we cover it in. So we can fit the 2 8-gauge, the dual RCA, the base knob, and the remote turn on all through this tubing. So we have, that's that nice umbilical cord that we build. We use the 3/4. And of course, for specialty, we carry a 1/2 inch red. The reason why we carry the 1/2 inch red is because then we can do 0 gauge if we need to, just like such. And obviously it will fit over a 4 gauge, no problem. Now another thing that we commonly cover are USBs. When we run these through the car, we want to have some kind of protection over them because we just don't want these ends to get all ripped up. For that, we are going to be using the 1/2 inch, not because the wire is particularly thick, but because we need it to go over this big end here. And then what we typically will do is take our 3:1, 3/4, put it over the big head, and then it'll shrink down nice at the tip here because it is 3:1. So as you can see, we use a lot of different sizes to do different things. So there's not just like, hey, all I need is this and I can do it. There are some overlap in heat shrink as well as braided loom. Now what I'll go ahead and do is we buy this from a specific vendor here in Florida. They are on the internet. You may have to buy more than you want, and they really don't answer the phone. It's 100% internet. I'll go ahead and put a link to them in the show notes. All right guys, thank you so much for tuning in as always. You guys have a wonderful day, and remember, if you want to get the tools that we use for all our installs, you can find them all at D&F Tool Drawer. You guys have a good night. We'll see you later next time. Bye.